In today's lecture, we will be discussing leverage. You might have heard this term a lot. Now, question is, what does leverage means? You may heard things like the banks are highly leveraged, or the corporations or industries or firms are highly leveraged. But there is a very specific definition of leverage. So leverage is an investment strategy of using borrowed money, specifically the use of various financial instruments or borrowed capital to increase the potential return of an investment. So in the bank's case, if banks borrow a lot of money, remember when they borrow money, they can borrow it from the Fed and they can use that money to buy assets. So banks can essentially can borrow unlimited amount of money and that can transform into assets in terms of loans or buying securities. Now, when they borrow money, they can also have the potential of buying more asset as a result returns. And when returns increases, it means that banks are highly leveraged because they are borrowing money to pump up their balance sheet. Now, there are different measures of leverage. Let's talk about some of those measures or two specific measures of leverage. One measure is leverage is the ratio of equity or again bank capital over assets. And mind you, this is the inverse of equity multiplier that we discussed in the last lecture. So inverse of equity multiplier is leverage or bank capital over assets. There's another measure of leverage which is often broadly used is debt over equity capital or bank capital. Again, depending on the studies you have seen, either of the leverage measures are used. Let me give you an example how leverage kind of led to a banking failure during the 2008 crisis. So what it shows is the leverage in investment banks in the year 2007 and also prior to and since the crisis. So in the left graph here, you can see these are all the commercial banks and these are investment banks. So commercial banks like Citigroup, which was highly leveraged at that time, had a leverage ratio of 15 and they're using a leverage ratio of debt over capital. So the measure they're using is leverage is debt over capital. So for Citigroup, it was around actually close to 20, which essentially means that for every dollar of shareholder money, they borrowed $20. For investment banks like Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers, which actually failed, had a leverage of almost 30, which essentially means that for every dollar of shareholders' money, they borrowed $30. Now, as we explained in the last lecture, shareholders love to have borrowed money because that can increase their returns and which essentially can increase their returns on equities. And as a shareholder, all you care about is the return on equities. But the question is this kind of highly leveraged banks also runs the risk of bank failure when some of their investments, especially loans, go bad. That we learned in the last lecture. So during the crisis of 2008, so many of these banks lent out a lot of money to mortgages or mortgage-backed securities. Those are the securities they purchased. When those securities started failing, their assets declined. Now, when their assets declined, they really didn't have a lot of cushion in terms of capital. So their balance sheet couldn't balance, and that's why they failed. And that's why Fed tried to inject money to pump up their balance sheet. Same is true for Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch, how they deleveraged. And you can see prior to 2008, Morgan Stanley had a leverage of almost 30 and Goldman Sachs had a leverage of 25. But after the crisis, since the crisis, look at their leverage, how it has come down to a level of around 10. Now, obviously, leveraging is a way to pump up your balance sheet and pump up your assets, but it comes at a huge risk. And that's why Fed controls the leverage for banks. So what's the new Fed regulations? To be classified as well capitalized, a bank's leverage ratio, mind you, here we are using the definition of amount of capital divided by bank's total assets. That's the inverse of equity multiplier. So leverage ratio must exceed 5%. That means bank capital should be at least 5% of total liabilities. A lower leverage ratio, especially below 3%, triggers an increased regulatory restrictions on the bank. So this is what happens when the leverage increases too much. That means if their capital divided by total bank assets is less than 3%, it's a concern, and those are highly leveraged banks. So again, when we're using the concept of leverage, you should be very clear about which definition of leverage you are using. And in this class, we will be using either of those definitions, but we'll make sure we'll clear it up, because in the literature in finance, either of these measures are used.